I think we'll go ahead and get started. Everyone looks like they have their pizza in hand. So I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute here at WSU. On behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which is a continuation of our series this semester on the politics of climate change. Today we're very fortunate to have with us two speakers from the other side of the Cascades. Aseem Prakash is the Walker Family Professor for Arts and Sciences and the Director of the Center for Environmental Politics at the University of Washington. Professor Prakash is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Board on Environmental Change and an International Research Fellow at the Center for Corporate Reputation at Oxford University. Among Aseem's many awards is the American Political Science Association's Eleanor Ostrom Career Achievement Award, which is given in recognition of a lifetime contribution to the study of science, technology, and environmental politics. He's also received from the International Studies Association the Distinguished International Political Economy Scholar Award, which recognizes a scholar whose work has had a lasting impact in that field. Aseem will be our second speaker today. Our first speaker today is Nives Dolšak, who is the Bearer Professor in Sustainability Science and the Director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington. Professor Dolšak has published widely in leading journals of environmental studies and public policy, and she has co-authored two books with Eleanor Ostrom, The Drama of the Commons and The Commons in the New Millennium. Professor Dolšak was nominated by Governor Jay Inslee to the Washington Coastal Marine Advisory Council, and she also serves on the science panel of the Puget Sound Partnership. Both of our speakers today have published widely in more popular outlets such as Slate Magazine, the Washington Post, HuffPost, and Forbes, among many others. So join me now in welcoming Aseem Prakash and Nives Dolšak.
Thank you so much for a really generous and kind invitation. Thank you for joining us today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, seeing how many people have taken the time to come and join us and discuss these issues. I'm very curious, if you would please indulge me, how many of you have, let's say in the last half a year, participated in a protest about climate, environmental issue about how your local natural resources are used, land use regulations, land use changes, anything in the area of natural resources? Show of hands. Yeah, about a quarter of people. So I think we're all care and we're all engaged, and it's good to know how we can be most effective and what are the ways in which these public protests can have an impact. And that's what the talk is about today. I have the first half of the talk, and then Aseem will take over the second half of the talk. The two pictures that we have on the slide, the picture on the top was the cream cheese pastry tossed on Mona Lisa in Louvre. The picture below was the tomato soup tossed on Van Gogh sunflowers in London National Gallery. None of the paintings were damaged because they're both covered with protective surface, but nevertheless there was a concern about damage being caused to these sort of world heritage pieces of art. Before we delve into climate activism, let's review where the state of climate policy is globally, and then we'll delve into U.S. national issues. Remember the Paris Agreement, the wide global agreement that if at all possible, we should work towards not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius increase above the baseline. We said if we cannot reach that, we should definitely not go over 2 degrees Celsius. The recent UN reports, a lot of data are showing that we are not likely going to meet the 1.5 degrees centigrade target. It's very unlikely that we'll reach that. The gaps between what we would have to be doing globally as opposed to what we're doing, are just too wide. In addition to slow action, we, the global society, has had shocks that have kind of put us a few steps back with respect to climate action, inflation, energy inflation, so higher costs that were the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those higher costs kind of redirected the focus in many countries away from decarbonization to keeping energy costs low, because access to energy is an essential commodity for all households. So we had those competing, most societies had those competing goals of decarbonization on the one hand and providing electricity at affordable price to the households who need it. At the same time, there was a concern about security, right? During the inflation, the invasion of Ukraine, Russia simply shut off the supply of natural gas to Western Europe for some time, right? And that was not just the price, but simply lack of natural gas in Europe. So energy security concerns were really heightened as a result of the invasion. So those competing issues have kind of further reduced the global commitment and the ability for us to decarbonize. We know that firms and countries are committing to decarbonizing. We're probably all familiar with the net zero concept. Firms commit to it, countries commit to it. So I'm not saying that there's absolutely no action. I'm just saying there is action, and we're seeing some backsliding because of the issues that we're facing. And also the commitments that are being made, they're not all the same. In this article that we co-authored with Dr. Coe, which was published in PLOS Climate, we've examined how different net zero commitments are across countries. And we've noticed major differences in terms of how stringent they are, how fast the target year comes, whether they have been translated into domestic legislation, whether there is accountability mechanism, how do they interact with international carbon flows, imports, shipping, and so on. So there are many aspects of these stringency, of these commitments, and we see vast variation on this. So again, it's not that we don't see any commitment. There are commitments, but some of them are not very stringent and are not likely to lead to major greenhouse gas emission reductions. If we look at global data, and if we look at how electricity is generated, we see that coal is still a very important source of electricity. Why do we have electricity on this slide? Because one very important mitigation strategy is electrification. But for that to really be decarbonization strategy, the electricity has to be generated from non-carbon sources. If we continue burning coal and then use that electricity to power our cars, we haven't really accomplished that much, right? So we really have to decarbonize our electricity generation. And the data at the global level here are showing that we're moving quite slowly. Especially in some countries, the coal power plants are still coming online. They're more efficient than they were in the past, but they're still being added quite regularly. For example, China is building 2 coal plants every week, right? Nevertheless, we do have wind, we do have solar electricity. The costs have come down significantly of generating electricity through those, with those technologies. But there's still far to go. So if we then see this backsliding on targets and commitments, if we see increased use of coal in electricity generation, if we see even current US administration issuing permits for new oil drilling, current US administration building infrastructure for sending liquefied natural gas to Europe, again responding to those energy security concerns. If we are facing all this, what should then those who care about climate, we'll call them climate activists, what should then climate activists do? the literature coming from sociology, coming from other social science disciplines, is really rich on social movement, social activism, social movement organizations. Broadly, we talk about five approaches. Activists can persuade. By persuasion, we mean they can lobby officials who make decisions. They can try to change public perceptions. The second approach is they can mobilize. They can organize strikes, protests, and rallies. And many of us in this room participate in this one strategy. They can litigate. In the US, for example, there are two legal doctrines that allow climate activists to see action in courts. One is the public trust doctrine, one is the nuisance doctrine. So we're seeing some environmental NGOs using these strategies successfully, mostly about fossil fuel infrastructure. The fourth approach is to disrupt. We have seen successful protests about oil pipelines and where oil pipelines should go, so location of oil pipelines, other fossil fuel projects. We have seen social movement organizations disrupt sport events. Wimbledon, for example, I don't know if Burning Man would be considered a sport event. It's definitely an entertainment event. That was disrupted. Cultural events such as Gay Pride Parade and the museum vandalism. And the presentation today, what we will be talking about today, focuses on museum vandalism, not on these other forms of activism. And the last one is property violence, which we've addressed in some of our short commentaries in Forbes. If we look at climate movements, there is a lot of heterogeneity in what actors can do, and that heterogeneity is driven by a number of reasons. Who the activists are, what are the institutions in which they're situated, who their targets are, what their resources are. So different activists choose different strategies. While they may cooperate and coordinate the action, they also do compete. They compete for resources, for example, donations. They compete for media attention, right? So they have to carefully strategize what is the best thing that they can do, given the target audience and given the resources that they have. In addition to competition within the climate activism sphere, there's also competition about other social issues that we, or many of us, care about, right? So there's this competition for media attention, for public attention, for resources, where climate competes on other issues, social justice issues, employment issues, inflation issues, and so on. And lastly, exogenous shocks, such as Fukushima or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, can also alter the trajectory and highlight some other concerns over climate change. So to answer what should climate activists do, we propose that we think about how climate change happens. How climate change policy happens. We know how climate change happens. How climate change policy happens. And we talk about 5 models which we wrote about in our commentary, How to Reboot Climate Policy After COP27, 5 models of policy making. So as we see, there are 5 models of climate change policy making, and I have 1 slide on each model. And then depending on what model we believe works and what stage in climate change policy making we believe we are, we as climate activists then choose one or another strategy. So I think it's important that we talk about these 5 models because they help us understand what is the best approach, where we would have the most impact. Model 1, climate change is a scientific problem. We are facing climate change problems because we don't have enough information. If we just generate more knowledge, if we just generate more information that we agree on, at the global level. For example, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which brings together scientists from all over the world, and their findings are then even signed off by politicians. So if we have that kind of consensus on knowledge, then we will see progress. Then we will see positive changes in climate change policy. That is model one. I'm not saying that's where we are, but that's one of the models that we've seen in climate change policy making. The problems with that model is the first one is called in literature motivated reasoning. What that means is that I read the literature that I want to read. I'm not going to read everything. I'm going to read the literature that will tell me, yes, these fires, wildfires that we're seeing all over the West Coast, they're definitely accentuated by climate change. I'm not saying that's the case, but if I believe that is the case, that will be the literature and the information I'll be seeking out. That's the explanation of motivated reasoning. So to say that we just need more information and then we will see climate change policies enacted, the problem with that is that that information not everyone may read. They will simply read what they want to read. What's happening specifically in the US also is that trust in that climate change in general and also political discourse is becoming really polarized. We're simply not reading across the aisle anymore. We're not holding conversations across the aisle. And the trust in science is eroding. We've seen that in COVID and how we responded to scientific information about COVID and how we should protect ourselves. We're seeing this in climate change. And then the last problem in model one, where the science or lack of science is the cause of the problem, the last concern is that this policy then becomes too high reliance on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the next report. Let's just wait for the 7th report and then everything will be fine and we'll move on. Not really. We've had report 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. We can all count. And yes, some things have happened, but we have not seen as much change as we needed to. So that's climate change as a scientific problem. What should activists do if we were in this stage? They should be arguing for more science, generation of more science, and making more science publicly available. Model 2, climate change is a moral problem, not a scientific problem. What we're doing currently is not morally correct. It hurts future generations. And what we need to do is we simply need to stop growing in a number of ways. So degrowth is the solution. On the right-hand side here, we snipped the top of our article that we published in Climate Action with Dr. Nila Marchovska. Pope Francis' climate message and meat tax, evidence from survey experiment in Italy. What we've done here is we've tested on a nationally representative sample, we've tested what happens if we provide respondents a moral argument for change in behavior, moral argument with a specific moral authority name assigned to it, and that was Pope Francis, or a philosophy professor, and we chose a generic Italian name. So that was the experiment that we did. Why in Italy? Because Pope's message, very strong environmental message, Laudato Si, was obviously going to resonate more in Italy because Rome, Vatican is in Italy, the really high share of Catholics in Italy. We were expecting that moral authority of Pope Francis would have an impact on people's decision about supporting meat tax. Why meat tax? Because animal husbandry is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. And several European countries are considering meat tax as a tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we've done some work, and what we found there is that authority, the moral authority, did not have a positive impact on people's willingness to support, in this case, meat tax. So moral appeals are not working, and it's difficult to talk about degrowth with massive poverty and inequality, right? If we're situated in a flourishing urban area and are having academic conversations about degrowth, that's one thing. But if we just look around ourselves in the same city and see major inequity and poverty, then we are reminded that degrowth is not a solution for a larger segment of our population. Model 3, climate change is a technological problem. There's a technology gap, so we need technologies that make it easier for us to decarbonize our energy supply, and massive investment is needed to create cost-competitive technology, and we need to build its support infrastructure. So that was the focus in the past. Now we're also adding 2 additional foci. One is geoengineering and carbon capture. So if we just get the technologies right, that will solve the climate change problem. Challenges of this model are a couple. Technologies need helping hand from the government, right? They need R&D money. They need governmental help to get them to the point where technologies can be commercialized, and even that, oftentimes they have to be subsidized. And to have that helping hand from the government, you need to have government willingness to support that. Second, industrial policies lead to rent-seeking. So rent-seeking behavior, meaning firms, that is the private sector, changes their behavior in the attempt to capture revenue, rents from the government. And the government start picking the winners and the losers. Model 4, climate change is an economic problem. We have climate change just because we haven't internalized the social cost of, we haven't internalized the cost of carbon. So if we just internalize the externality, we will solve the problem. We just have to correct for the market failure, often a response that we hear from our colleagues in economics. So we introduce carbon pricing and we change the market. The problem is that carbon pricing, for example, in Washington State, the Cap and Invest, in British Columbia, carbon tax, and so on, we have these approaches in several states and provinces around us. They do increase energy costs, which is politically unpopular and also unfair, unjust to those parts of population who are low income and pay a higher proportion of their income just for their electricity. So they're important justice issues. Model 5 then is climate change is a political problem, not an economic, scientific, moral, or technological. And what we mean by that is that the benefits and costs of decarbonization are unevenly distributed. That holds for the cost of climate adaptation as well. On the right-hand side, we have 2 maps from an article, it's an R&R, also with Dr. Ko, on responses to siting of renewable sources. Right? So if we want to generate electricity from new renewable sources, oftentimes we have to site either new solar farms or new wind farms. The black shaded counties in the US, the top, I think the top is solar and the bottom is wind.
The top is wind.
The top is wind, thank you. The black shaded counties are the counties that have enacted anti-wind regulations. So local governments in the US are using different types of tools. Usually it's about zoning, where wind farms can or cannot be. What is the setback, how high the structures can be, how visible they can be from the town, and so on. So we're seeing local pushback on decarbonization technologies. The top is wind, the below graph is solar. So the solution then is equitable spread of benefits and just transition. We have to find out ways to more equitably spread those costs and benefits. The problem with that approach is that equity can clash with faster diffusion. Example of net metering debate in various states. And the second question is, who pays for it? We all believe that just transition is the right way to go. But who pays for that just transition? Where does that money come? Does that come from fossil fuel users? Does it come from general budget? Those are the difficult questions. And this is where probably political scientists mostly find the core challenge. And therefore, social activists who believe that this is where we are have to work on how we more equitably spread those costs and benefits. And I think that's where I am, then you take over.
Okay. So essentially, God is dead, Marx is dead, I'm not feeling too well either. That's what a critic wrote when John Galbraith wrote The Industrial Nation in New Statesman. That was the critic. And when we talk about environmental issues, you feel kind of helplessness and what to do. So to summarize what Nives has presented, that in our opinion, science and morality play a lesser role in contemporary climate politics. We are not saying they play no role, they play lesser role because we are at the crucial stage. Economics in terms of corrective market failures is not a problem. Probably Governor James Lee can talk about that. You raise the price of fossil fuel and you get a very, very severe backlash. Cap and Invest is supposed to raise the carbon price. It's carbon pricing. That's social cost of carbon. And yet nobody, no authentic environmentalist wants to own up the fact that people have to pay for polluting. Technology is important, and technology solutions are happening. Bill Gates and Elon Musk and everybody else, they're investing heavily in it. And it is attracting a lot of interest. It's very top-down and it's also very controversial, especially if you get into things like geoengineering, which are morally problematic, or carbon capture. As political scientists, we are very interested in politics, and we think the real problem in contemporary climate politics is politics, unequal distribution of benefits and costs. And this is where climate activists could, should, and probably would intervene. And the idea is to raise the issue salience, to suggest concrete, actionable solutions, and the idea is to alter the political calculus of policymakers. We published a paper where we showed that actually Green New Deal, the members of the US Congress who approved, who subscribed, who voted in favor of the Green New Deal resolution, on average got a 2% vote bump in the 2020 elections. So this is not to say climate change, climate issues don't have political traction. They do, but we have to persuade the policymakers that do. But when we do activism, we have to do about the right cause, and we have to do at the right venues, because our tactics must have legitimacy. There's also legitimacy gap in some of the work that climate activists do. So if you think of that list of climate tactics Nives had suggested, the last one was violence, property violence. And after the movie, Blowing Up the Pipeline, How to Blow Up the Pipeline, there was a lot of excitement, especially amongst academics, about, oh my God, blowing up the pipeline is so cool. And some of us who said no, you know how things go on social media. So we were the really, really bad people in the pocketbook of all industry, and I said, I just wish that were true. Life would be much easier, but that's not true. Bottom line is that property violence or violence of any kind invites a backlash. A very large number of states, 17 states in the US, actually have critical infrastructure laws, where activists that are disrupting or kind of harming in any ways oil pipelines and critical infrastructure, as the state defines it, can be subjected to very severe penalties. And similar laws have come up and are being enforced in the United Kingdom, in Germany, France. In fact, France has banned an environmental organization. So there's a crackdown happening. So apart from the moral problem of violence, whether against individuals or properties, in our opinion, this is not a very good strategy for climate activism, because it's putting climate action in a sphere that we don't want. Second is the disruption. And there are different kinds of disruption. We actually have, as we talk, a conjoint experiment going on in UK, where we give a menu of disruptive tactics and ask people to kind of take that into account and tell us what kind of environmental organizations they'd like to support. This started happening in 2022, and Nives and I read about it. We were very intrigued, so we thought we should kind of study this a bit deeper. So what is the theory of change here? The way we understand, based on work of Dana Fisher and scholars who've actually done a deep dive on this. So essentially the idea is two things. You raise the issue salience by doing things which are very dramatic that media will pick up, and yet they don't disturb everyday life. And you create what is called the radical flank effect. That when a radical group comes on the sphere, on the horizon, and undertakes tactics, the mainstream groups start looking more reasonable. And the policymakers have more incentives to kind of negotiate with the mainstream group. So this, we infer, is the theory of change that is kind of motivating these incidents. In 2022, there were 38 incidents. We said, okay, let's study them. This is so cool. So we took a help of our undergraduate student, Lily Kinnan, who is the first author, and we created a database. It's publicly available. All of you are welcome to use it, to see when did this happen, during what time period, which months, where, in which countries, and which climate activists actually vandalized museums. So if you look at all the 38 incidents, essentially 60%, about 2/3, are in 3 countries: UK, Italy, and Germany. Maybe that's because these countries have a lot of museums. So if you want to protest against a museum, that's the place to go. So maybe that's part of the explanation. And most of them happened between May and December, peaking around the COP meeting in Egypt. So it was not a random, it was very carefully orchestrated incidents of museum vandalism to highlight the environmental problems, and basically the message was just stop oil. It was anti-fossil fuel. So it's predominantly a European phenomenon. It's a shock tactic to increase media attention, which it did. It's very carefully choreographed. If you look at the YouTube feeds on when these social activists, after throwing something on Mona Lisa, they make a statement. It's very interesting. It's sometimes they read out, sometimes they'll speak extemporaneously. It's very carefully choreographed. But is this the attention, the good attention, that will motivate climate action? That will make people say, oh my God, yes, I hadn't thought about this. This is so important. Policymakers would think, oh my God, there's a public upsurge, we should do something about that. Or is it motivating, oh my, these people again, and motivating environmental crackdown? I think that is where the rubber meets the road. This is activism work. And essentially, 3 organizations that are doing about, again, 58 to 60% of these incidents. All members of the 822 network, and if you go to their website and look at what they say, it worries me a bit, because the language is, we will do whatever. We are in the last hour, the darkest hour. This sounds, at least to us, very grim. Yes, we have a climate problem, and yes, things need to be fixed, but making these extreme statements and actually believing them, if they do, makes us worry, because what comes next if this is the theory of change that some of these groups are following? So who are these people? And why are the legacy groups like Greenpeace? Like Greenpeace was known for these dramatic action. Boarding ships, furling banners from the top of important buildings, doing all these kinds of things, dramatic events. But Greenpeace is not vandalizing museums at all. In fact, mainstream groups are not vandalizing museums at all. So there is a kind of a split or division of labor between what we call the legacy groups and the new groups. And which is kind of mirroring the generational divide. Though some of the activists who are vandalizing museum they're more like our age. So they're not exactly young. But generation, maybe in terms of thinking of how people think instead of what their actual age is. And is this really a mass movement, or this is really a Twitter, Instagram movement based on social media? And this is very important, because if it's not a mass movement, it's essentially a social media movement then the appeal is quite limited. And we'll talk about, I'll talk about this in a moment. So the divide between real media and social media and what particular platform we want to use could affect our legitimacy in different groups. But there's a bigger debate that we need to have. Martinez Allier, in a very interesting book, talked about 3 kinds of environmentalism. One was the conservation movement, the gospel of wilderness. The second was the gospel of eco-efficiency, ecological modernization, the technological so-called. And the third kind of environmentalism is environmentalism of the poor. And environmental movements can be put in these categories, and we can disagree or agree with these categories based on what do they do, their discourse, their tactics, what kind of people participate in it. And for us, who are deeply concerned about justice issues, and we think it's the environmental injustice, climate justice, which is the biggest impediment for climate action, we think we need environmentalism of the poor, where the concerns of poor people, whether it's farmers who are protesting against the solar farms, or it's people in inner cities who are protesting against pollution, their concerns should be at the center of environmental movement. So is museum vandalism environmentalism of the poor? Or is it reinforcing, this is really environmentalism of the privileged? The kind of tactics they employ, the kind of things they demand, and the kind of people they represent. So is it reinforcing the perception that climate movement has been captured by urban elites? I've just come back from India, and I kind of talked at random with people about museum vandalism. They said, huh? Because in India, nobody really goes to museums. And I think I can speak on behalf of most developing countries. Museums are lovely, but nobody goes there. You don't have them. There are other ways to think about culture. There are other ways to think of in terms of celebrating your heritage. So first of all, museums are non-issues, and if somebody vandalizes a museum, they say, okay, I don't know what you're talking about. So it's very interesting, the North-South divide, how this is limited. It's a very, very European phenomenon, limited to specific countries and with specific kind of tactics. But there's a broader issue. Museum vandalism, all these groups say, stop fossil fuel. And yeah, fossil fuels are a big problem. Both Nives and I are environmentalists, we actually are activists, we participate in protests. But we also understand there's a different side to the story. And if you look at Pew polls, yes, people want climate change, but the majority does not want stopping fossil fuels. And what could be more important than the ongoing strike of United Auto Workers? We wrote this piece, Climate Clashes with Labor, and essentially one of the big concerns of auto workers is electric vehicles. Electric vehicles require fuel workers, and they are being manufactured in non-union plants, specifically in the South, and it's going to hurt organized labor. And it's a real problem. In fact, this is why President Biden, if the newspapers are to be believed, is in a bit of a pickle. Because he's pro-labor, but he's also pro-climate, but labor is taking a very strong positions on the electric vehicle issue. So there is this huge debate about just transition. That, okay, the problem with climate change is it's a global public good, but the costs are local. If you want people to bear these costs, you have to make them an offer about transition. That's the logic of the welfare state. People who are hurt by economic disruption are given a helping hand. So that, and it's not only about jobs. Jobs is about, it's about self-esteem. It's about social issues. So jobs are much more than actual money. So when we think about just transition, are we really thinking about just transition for the auto workers in a creative way? Just transition debate so far has been for coal workers, but what Nives are saying is, it's not only fuel producing, but fuel using sectors, what we say climate exposed sectors, that need to be taken into account into the just transition debate, which is not being taken into account. So it would be lovely if museum vandalism, they would say just transition, climate justice, justice for fossil fuel workers, but they don't say that. They just say stop fossil fuels. Stop fossil fuels is just moving the problem to another social sphere where we are going to have the backlash. But there's a deeper problem. Most of you must have heard this song, this Rich Men West of Cascades. So it's a very interesting song. But it is kind of symbolizing the rural-urban divide, which is now being documented. In fact, New York Times is documenting it. The Democrats are no longer party of the working class. Working class is now favoring Republicans over Democrats. Even amongst non-whites, the share of Republican support has risen dramatically in Hispanics. It's actually at par with college-educated people. And this divide is mirroring urban and rural divide. Nives had talked about backlash against siting of renewable energy facilities. 24% of the US counties, there are slightly more than 3,100 counties in the US, 24%, every fourth US county has enacted ordinances restricting siting of solar wind plants. And when we ran our numbers, liberal counties are more likely to enact these ordinances than conservative counties. So we also have to get over this thing about Republicans hate climate. No, I think the story is more complicated. At the federal level, yes, but not necessarily at the local level. So Christopher Clark's famous book, The Sleepwalkers, tells the story of sleepwalking into World War I. And sometimes people say that climate change, we are sleepwalking. We don't think so. I think the eyes are wide open. People see the consequences of climate change all over. What is the problem is, we have political problems. We have political bottlenecks. And it's just somebody who opposes climate action doesn't mean that person is a climate denier. The concerns are genuine. And unless until we look at these concerns about who's picking up the tab, who's picking up the climate costs of transition, and we have a policy to address it with respect, with dignity, I think the backlash will increase. The backlash will accentuate. So whenever we are agitating, we are as activists, as scholars, as students for climate issues, we have to keep in mind, in our opinion, that climate action must be environmentalism of the poor. It must be the environmentalism of the underprivileged. And we must put justice issues at the center of it. Justice both in terms of who bears the cost of climate action and climate inaction. And museum vandalism, in our opinion, is probably not a very good vehicle to overcome these political bottlenecks. So thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you manage the context issue. You've highlighted the vandalism that takes place in museums. Do you also highlight the murders of activists in places like South America?
We do not.
Okay.
And you are absolutely right that environmentalism of the poor receives a lot of backlash.
Right.
And it's not only environmental activists, environmental reporters are being subjected to violence. And we don't take into account in this, but you're absolutely right. Agitating for the environmentalism, for environmental causes, where there is a clear distributional conflict, often leads to counter-violence. And this is what we need to avoid. Violence has to be condemned, whether it's violence for or against. You're right, in the United States, probably we fear state violence against activists, but in other places, there are also violence by oil companies, by autocrats, against activists who are opposing pollution. I think that's an excellent point.
I just want to add something. In our presentation today, we focused on activism, mostly in European countries, right? The 3 European countries. What we didn't talk about, we didn't get into in our conversation, is generic protest, just stop oil, versus a protest about a particular pipeline going in a particular area where it's a high danger that it's going to impact the drinking water of the population that lives there. That's a different kind of protest. It has a very clear message. It's focused on a particular issue in that locale. And that is obviously much more effective. And we've seen that in the US than this generic don't stop oil anywhere in the world. I mean, really this ambiguous agenda. So I think it's important to clarify that today when we were talking about ineffectiveness and wrong strategy, it's about these generic museum protests rather than a specific protest in a particular protest by Chipko movement in the Himalayas about deforestation, in Latin America about the damage that the oil sector is causing and so on. So we didn't highlight that.
Or the
enough
Dakota Access
today.
Pipeline, to build on your excellent point, the oil companies brought in dogs. The way they tried to intimidate the activists in the United States of America was absolutely shameful. But Dakota Access Pipeline, as Nives said, is a specific protest against a specific problem. The pipeline was rerouted to go through the Indian reservation. That was not the original route. So the complaints, the grievances of the activists were very clear. The mobilization of the people that turned up to protest, it was very clear that they are organized, they protested against a specific harm. And that's why it generated so much of public support. And now the Army Corps of Engineers is probably going to cancel the license if something is to, newspaper reports are to be believed. So you're right. The counter-violence has to be part of the equations when we talk of tactics in general. Go ahead.
Yeah, so like there's this argument that like violence breeds counter-violence, right? But it seems like in a lot of these scenarios, Dakota Access Pipeline, and a lot of these, climate activists that are in South America, like they weren't being violent. They were just kind of existing, doing, non-violent protests. And it was met with like immediate repression, violent repression. So it seems like that's gonna happen anyway. So this argument that violence then begets counter-violence, I think overlooks the fact that if you're challenging, state sovereignty or the sovereignty of, markets or something like that, there's going to be people with guns that are going to come down on you pretty hard.
Should I? Would you?
Or with laws and
Yeah.
making your protest a criminal activity and exposing you to higher visit to state penitentiary, right?
So there are two
Yeah.
ways to look at it. The point you're making is a complicated one, and it's a very good one. So one is, okay, you do violence, I do violence, and you do violence, and then I do violence. Where does it stop? And eventually, who has a competitive advantage in violence? So is that the road we want to take? That is one kind of an argument. The other is, we all condemn all violence. If there is a violence in Ecuador, in India, etc., against activists, we condemn it, we use the appropriate forums to highlight it and to sanction it. And we also condemn any attempts at violence within the United States where laws work, by and large, quite well. There's a lot of problems, but the laws work quite well. And here, blowing up a pipeline, I don't think it has the same consequences as violence in other places. So from a strategic perspective, all of us want justice, all of us want for a peaceful society. Our suggestion is that probably violence is not a good route anywhere. And violence has to be opposed, condemned, sanctions, persecuted. And maybe we need to organize to make sure, okay, these are the countries in developing countries where oil companies and states have sponsored, executed violence. Let's prosecute them. Let's make sure that international forums are fully equipped to handle these kinds of egregious, violations of human rights. We would take that route. Please.
So I was part of a discussion last night with some farmers who were talking about developing a solar policy for Whitman County. And they mentioned that Benton County has an anti-solar policy. And it is not what you might think it is. Those people in that county, which is a very rural county like Whitman County is, saw solar farms taking up farmland, and they said, we feed the world. We can't let this happen. So, I think you have to realize that maybe anti-solar policy is really pro-agriculture. There are lots of reasons that counties might decide they don't want to go.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In fact, the paper Nives mentioned that we have just submitted the revised version. That's exactly what we find, that the level of ruralness is actually a positive predictor of the probability of enactment of the laws. And it's not only limited to solar farms, it's also limited to, say, the lithium mine. That you want to mine lithium in a place which is ecologically sensitive, then you are making trade-offs. So here is a trade-off between food and renewable energy, and there it's a trade-off between Native American cultural sites, religious sites, and ecologically sensitive, sometimes threatened species. and renewable energy. So what you're saying exactly is the challenge. Climate change involves trade-offs. It's not a win-win. And we need a deliberative, thoughtful, and respectful dialogue on how to resolve this trade-off. We can't say just because you're a farmer who opposes solar panels or solar farms, you're a climate denier. I don't think that's very helpful. In fact, that was going to create a backlash.
I just want to add something to that conversation. I've heard two arguments presented against solar or wind in rural counties. One of the argument was, why would we be generating electricity if it's just going somewhere else? Well, so is the food, so is the hay. So that argument to me doesn't hold water, right? So when I understand that, and I agree with both of you, that there is a difference between food and energy, but maybe not as much as we all think, and maybe some of those arguments that want to portray it as it's more important to grow the food. Yeah, it's sometimes food for us, but it's oftentimes hay for export. So I think we need to have nuanced conversations there, and maybe that's where the role of activists is, to have conversations that clarify these issues.
And the same debate is happening about offshore wind. It's not only a New Jersey phenomenon, that you were in that meeting yesterday.
Yeah, and I serve on the WCMAC, Washington Marine and Coastal Advisory Council. That is the council that advises the governor, and Governor says BOEM is making available leases off of the Washington coast, and that's in federal waters. But of course, the fishing communities on the outer coast are saying, you're going to destroy pretty much the only source of income we have. We have nothing else. We're not going to manufacture those wind turbines. We're not going to install them. Maybe our ports are going to help a little bit. We don't have shipyards. So essentially, we're going to lose our income, fishing and crabbing, and all of the jobs will essentially go to Puget Sound. So absolutely, that argument, we are paying on our backs for the benefit that's either for the state or for the country or for global. That is everywhere. That's why we keep saying climate change problems are political problems, or how do we compensate that? And yesterday, the vice chairman of the Makah tribe in a meeting on offshore energy said, we will not accept compensation. Don't think that you'll pay us off and then we will allow wind offshore. No, we have treaty rights, we have the right to harvest in those areas. We're not going to accept compensation. So very, very important issues, absolutely, and different communities have different concerns.
So,
I was curious on how you think nuclear energy plays a role in transitioning from fossil fuels to more efficient sources.
so we are pro-nuclear. But having said this, we realize it's a hugely, hugely controversial issue. For a couple of reasons. When we see the safety record of nuclear, it's actually quite good. We did some work in Japan in the aftermath of Fukushima. When they wanted to restart Fukushima, we realized local communities which had nuclear plants actually wanted to restart the nuclear plants because of the concrete benefits from nuclear plants. And especially now with modular nuclear, I think there is a lot of potential. France generates about 25% of its nuclear energy, of its energy from nuclear. So in our opinion, given the severity of the climate crisis, the need for transition, the need to generate clean energy, nuclear is a very good bet. It has problems, everything has problems, but so does coal, so does wind, so does solar. So in our opinion, nuclear energy needs to be looked at very carefully. In fact, we are actually doing a paper. We are trying to understand how the position of environmental groups has changed in the last 10 years on nuclear energy. We're looking at the website using the Wayback Machine and systematically coding. And what we find preliminary is strategic silence. They're not opposing it, but they're keeping quiet. That's because historically, at least in Europe, the nuclear movement was the environmental movement. Environmental movement had roots in opposing nuclear plants. And these are legacy organizations that still carry a lot of clout. So I think there's a sensitivity, there's a kind of path of dependency about position in nuclear but we do detect some change at the margin. People who were vociferously against nuclear are now at least willing to have a conversation. And that is a conversation that needs to take place.
And just to add to it, is it okay?
Yeah.
And just to add to it, when you look at what happens when nuclear power plants are closed, Germany being an excellent example, what replaces electricity generation when nuclear is shut down? Coal. That's the most polluting way of generating electricity, so we definitely need to have a conversation.
I think people don't realize in this country, 19%, almost 20% of our energy, 1/5 is nuclear. And it is a clean source of energy. The problem is that a lot of the nuclear plants now are at a point where they need to be kind of renewed, and NRC is working on that. We've seen the spat in California about Diablo. Initially they said close it down, then they tried double hard not to close it down. In fact, took the federal subsidy to take it. So it's a complicated debate, but it's a debate we need to have, because it is an important source of clean energy that we simply cannot dismiss because of historical reasons.
I think it's 1 o'clock.
I think unfortunately, our time is up. Before I ask you in joining me in thanking our guests, let me remind you our series continues next Thursday, same time, same place. We have Bob English, who's a former member of Congress from South Carolina. He's an evangelical Christian. He's formed his own foundation that looks at climate change from the standpoint of faith, and he'll be talking about faith and climate science next Thursday, so join us then. But now, let's thank our two guests today for really interesting